Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to our today's workshop, which is going to be about how to develop a theoretical framework, which is a really important topic for researchers and also for graduate students. Today's workshop is going to be presented by Dr. Mona Sabir. I will introduce Dr. Mona Sabir. Dr. Mona Sabir is an associate professor at the English Language Institute at King Abdulaziz University. She was awarded a PhD degree in applied linguistics in 2015 from the University of Leeds in UK. Since then, Dr. Sabir has contributed to many academic management roles at King Abdulaziz University, including the head of research unit at Prince Khalid Al Faisal Center for Moderation, the supervisor of academic research section at the ELI, and the head of learning outcomes development administration unit at the Center for Education Outcomes Alignment with Labor Market. Dr. Sabir is currently the head of the quality and development unit at the ELI. Her research interests include second language acquisition of meaning and English language teaching classroom experimental research. Thank you, Dr. Mona, for accepting our invitation. The floor is yours. You may start now.
Thank you, Dr. Basim. I'm happy to be here today. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wassalatu wassalam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Allahumma allimna ma yanfa'na wa anfa'na bima 'allamtana wa zidna ilma. I'm here today to walk you through how to develop a theoretical framework for your research. In today's workshop, I will be focusing on the following areas. So I will start with the terminology and to establish meaning differences between certain terms that might be confusing for researchers. I will then move to exploring the use of theory in all types of research, namely quantitative research, qualitative and mixed method research. And then I'll give you some writing tips. We'll talk about the presentation of the theoretical framework in your research. And finally, we will go through evaluation criteria to evaluate the theoretical framework selection. Now to start, to talk about the nature of theories. Now, we want to explore together what is a theory in simple terms. Now, in everyday life situations, we encounter phenomenon that we cannot explain. And a theory attempts to give us an explanation for that phenomenon. Now, if I start with a simple kind of situation, it's an everyday life situation where every one of us can encounter. Imagine that you went back to your home and that you found your mother upset about something. So you're not sure what your mother is upset about. So you will start thinking, why is mom upset? Is it me? Did I make something wrong, for example? Or is it probably one of my siblings who did something wrong? Or is it that she received a phone call that was upsetting? Now, several explanations, several reasons of why my mother is upset. Now, if we could relate that situation to research and theory, now the situation that my mother is upset, this is the research problem, the thing that you want to answer through your research investigation. The reasons or the various explanations you're thinking about, this is the theory that you want to use to give an explanation for what's going on in your research. Now, after you think of all of these possibilities, you will start to investigate. So for example, you might talk to one of your siblings, ask him or her, what's wrong with mom, what's going on? So by doing that, as if you are collecting evidence or collecting data, okay, to find out what's going on actually here. So this is a simple day life situation that could be directly related to research. So a theory then attempts to explain observed phenomena. In other words, a theory answers the question, why? Why is this happening? Why is this, for example, observation taking place at a particular situation in a particular context? And all sciences basically use theory. So natural sciences, social sciences, both categories use theory to develop research. Now, so I hope now the idea is clear that a theory aims to or attempts to give an explanation for a natural phenomena, for certain observations, things that we observe every day. So what is a theory then? Now I gave you a simple situation, but of course the academic definition is different. A theory is a set of statements about natural phenomena that explain why these phenomena occur. So a key word here then is the word why. Why this occurs. So why is a key word here that's always associated with the word or the term theory. So a theory in any academic research, whether it's a dissertation or a journal article, etc., accounts for observable phenomena. So we observe something, we observe, for example, a certain health condition with patients that develops after taking some medication. That's an observed phenomenon. So we need a theory to address why this phenomenon occurs. So it also gives predictions about what could occur under specific conditions. If I go back to the simple example I gave you of my mother being upset, for example, one of the theories that I made is that she could be probably upset because of something I did myself. So under that, I can make predictions. I can say, well, if mom is upset with me, then I might get punished for that. So that's a prediction that was derived directly from my theory here, right? So it's a simple kind of, or it's a simplification for the idea, but I hope that you can relate that to your research. And a theory also unifies the generalizations made as part of the theory. So for example, after investigating using proper research tools, and after reaching the results and findings, you can actually make generalizations as part of the theory. So a theory then explains or tells us why a certain phenomenon occurs, it makes predictions, and it unifies generalizations as part of the theory. Now, across disciplines, and mashallah, here we have 40 participants today, and I'm sure that you come from different disciplines, but these are some examples of famous theories across disciplines. So we have the germ theory of disease, we have individual differences by Skinner. Now, this is in the field of psychology, for example. So under that theory, they found that, or the observation was that learners have different abilities in their reading comprehension. So the individual differences theory came to answer and to give an explanation why learners are different when it comes to reading comprehension, for example. We have also the special and the general relativity theory in physics by Albert Einstein. So these are some of the famous examples of theories across disciplines. Now, one of the key terminology that we need to define in this workshop before we go into the practical side of the workshop is the term model. If I asked you, and if you could reply in the chat by yes or no, do you know the difference between a theoretical framework and a theoretical model? Or do you think they are the same? Do you know the difference? Yes or no? Okay, perfect. So most of you replied saying no. And inshallah, today, I hope you leave the session with a clear understanding of the difference between theory and model. Now, theory answers the question why something happens. A model is related to theory, but it's different in the nature that it answers the question how. how different components of a phenomenon interact, for example. So usually a model is used to describe a process or a set of processes of a phenomenon. Now in research, okay, these terms, theory and model, they are used interchangeably. So it's fine. It's not something wrong if you said using a theoretical framework or a theoretical model. If you do that in writing, it's fine. But you need to know the difference in the assumption between the two. So a theory answers the question why something happens, but a model is more specific to the nature of the process of how a certain phenomena occurs, or how do different components of the phenomenon interact, for example. So if we look at a phenomenon in relation to health, the microorganisms and the microbes and stuff like that, and diseases, you might look at the process. So you will look at how this microorganism start and how it evolves and how it changes and how it affects us to create a certain disease, for example. This is a model because it shows us how the components of this particular phenomenon interact. Another important term is hypothesis. Now, I'm going to ask you the question again. Do you know the difference between theory and hypothesis? Yes or no, please, in the chat box. Theory and hypothesis? Perfect, perfect. So most of you said yes. And indeed, theory and hypothesis are totally different. So a hypothesis, if you want to understand the relationship in a better way between hypothesis and theory, a hypothesis is under the theory. So the theory is like the general umbrella, the overall kind of perspective. A hypothesis is just an idea, or in other words, another word for hypothesis is prediction. It's a prediction about a single phenomenon, but it does not act like a theory. It does not unify various phenomena. It does not account for everything that's going on. It's just related to a particular aspect of the general phenomenon. So if I go back to my example of my mother being upset, the theory was that I did something to upset my mom. The hypothesis or the prediction is, if I did something wrong, if my mom is upset with me, I will be punished. So this is a prediction that was made under the theory. So we use the theory actually to test whether these hypotheses are true or not. Okay, a very famous example in the literature about hypothesis comes from the language field, which is the critical period hypothesis. It basically says that learners at a certain age, when they reach that age, the puberty age, they will not be able to learn a second language similar and end up with an outcome similar to that of native speakers. Another important term is construct. Okay, now we need to know this terminology because they form the basis for developing a theory. A construct is key features or mechanisms on which the theory relies. In other words, constructs are the variables of the research. So we might, if I take the example of disease, for example, the germs and disease theory again, then we need to know what germ is, define it clearly, because based on the definition, the research scope will be different. That's why we highly encourage our students, we highly encourage ourselves when we write research to give a clear definition of what we mean by the research construct, because constructs can be defined in different ways. And based on the definition that we choose for the research, then probably a different theoretical perspective will be adopted. So construct, in other words, they are variables and they need to be defined clearly in the research. So far we looked at theory, hypothesis, model, and construct. We said that theory and model, the terms can be used interchangeably, but theory is totally different than hypothesis, and construct equals variables and key features that need to be defined clearly in the research. So Theory then, or developing a theoretical framework, is extremely important for your research. And in fact, there are different metaphors associating theory as puzzle solving, for example. Another very famous metaphor for theoretical framework is the blueprint of a house that was put by Grandin Osanlo back in 2014. So it acts like the blueprint for the entire dissertation. It's like a plan for everything. So it guides and supports the study, and it provides a structure that define how you philosophically, for example, methodologically, analytically, how you approach the dissertation as a whole. So every piece of research requires a theoretical framework because it acts like a blueprint of the entire dissertation. Then a theoretical framework, if we summarize the things I introduced so far, is that it accounts for observations. Any observation in science, whether natural science or social sciences, the definitions of concepts, the research design, the interpretations, the generalizations. I'm going to give you a simple example from the language field. I might be using lots of language frameworks because this is my major, but of course, what I say here applies to all other disciplines. Now, for example, if I choose to adopt a generative theory for teaching language. Now, generative approaches believe that language is natural, that we are born with it. So if I start teaching my students, like similar to what happens in a classroom, then this actually goes against the theory of choice. I couldn't actually execute a research adopting generative theory while I'm teaching students in the classroom. In fact, I should, for example, be exposing them to natural input, to natural conversation, because in that case, this will actually go in line with the theory of choice. So based on the theory of choice, lots of selections will be dependent on that. And you have also to look at the variables of the research. So for example, if there is a research in science looking at the effect of sunlight on the amount or for growing food, for example, or plants. So we have an independent variable, which is the sunlight. And we have the dependent variable, which is the rate of growth, for example. So what is the relationship between the variables? This is something that can also be guided by the choice of the theory. Now, this is based on various disciplines. These are some commonly used theories across disciplines. So we have theories here coming from the field of psychology, coming from the field of language, coming from physics, etc. So I just added it here for your reference. Okay, and then and for your information, it's good to know what are the commonly used theories across the disciplines. Another very important distinction before we move to application is the distinction between theoretical framework and conceptual framework. Now, if I ask you one last time, do you know the difference between theoretical framework and conceptual framework? Yes or no? Do you know the difference between the two? Theoretical framework, conceptual framework? Okay, okay, good, thank you so much. Okay, now a theoretical framework is what I've been explaining so far. So usually there's a theory that's established in the literature, and your job as a researcher is to find an appropriate theory that fits within your context, that fits within your variables, and basically you apply the selected theory to your whole dissertation or to your study. A conceptual framework, on the other hand, is more subjective to the researcher's point of view. Now, as a researcher, you do a lot of work. It's not just like you choose a theory and you apply it, but in fact, you evaluate your selection of the theory among other choices. So you would, for example, provide a rationale for your choice. You would say, well, for the purpose of research, the following framework was selected because of so and so and so. This is your evaluation. This is your overall view about the research. So you put your study as if it's the story that you are creating from your own perspective. So it's in your understanding of how the research problem will be explored, for example, what's the direction that the research will take. So it's more subjective to the view of the researcher, and that's a conceptual framework. So it is categorized as a system of concepts and assumptions and beliefs that support and guide the research plan. So a theoretical framework then is simply something that exists in the literature and can be validated by others, by researchers, by testing, and whether this kind of theory or selection is applicable to their situation. A conceptual framework is more subjective to the researcher's point of view and understanding of how the research problem and how the overall variables interact in the study. Now, after introducing the basic terminology and background required for this, we need to move into the different types of research, the quantitative type, the qualitative, and the mixed method research. Now, the use of theory in each type is different. Now, in quantitative research, we basically test hypotheses stemming from the theories. So we have a hypothesis, for example. The hypothesis states that if we increase the amount of sunlight, then the amount of growth will increase, for example. Then we will test it through the theory, and then it's if whether the theory is proven valid or not. That's what the quantitative research does. Now, on the other hand, in qualitative research, where there is a more holistic view of the behavior and attitudes in that context, theory is always, or that type of research generates theory. So we start with observations, we start with patterns, and from that, we start to classify them into patterns and certain categories until we reach a particular theory. So in quantitative research, the researchers often test the hypothesis, and the keyword here is test. In qualitative research, they generate theory by looking and using patterns and naturalistic generalizations. Now, in mixed method, we do both. So they test theories and they generate theories. So both is actually taking place under mixed method research. Now, there's also variation in the breadth of coverage. Now, if you think of theoretical framework, as I said, it acts like the blueprint of the house. It acts like a guide for the whole or the entire research, but there is variation in the amount of coverage. So some theoretical or some theories act at the micro level, which means that they address only a specific amount of time or a specific amount of data, just on a small level. Other theoretical frameworks might deal with a larger level, which is the macro level, looking at the institution level or the society level, accounting for holistic phenomena. And the meso level is something in between, where we find that the theory could also act as covering between micro and macro. So taking some aspects of small aspects and taking also bigger aspects at the macro level. So in other words, a theory does not necessarily cover the entire, let's say, observation based on the research. It could cover only one part, micro, or it could deal with it in a holistic manner at the larger level, which is the macro, or in between the meso level. Now, here comes the tips for academic writing. Now, if we want to represent, if we want to present theory in our writing, how can we do that? In quantitative research, there are three forms actually. So we can either present the theory as a series of hypotheses, or as logical statements, or as visual models. And I'm going to show you an example of each. So if you want to present it as a series of hypotheses, predictions, in other words, this is what you're going to do. So the higher one's rank, the greater is one's centrality. The greater is one's centrality, the greater one's observability. The higher one's rank, the greater one's observability. Here you're showing kind of the relationship between the variables. And this example is taken from Hopkins, 1964. As you can see, it's a series of hypotheses, not necessarily 7. It could be much less than that. It could be only 2 hypotheses or 1 hypothesis. That's fine, but that's the form of presenting it in writing, which is just in the form of a hypothesis, showing the prediction or showing the relationship between variables. Now, the other form in the writing is writing it as a logic statement. So what does that mean? You just simply write it as prose, as a paragraph, showing the logical relationship between the variables. Let's take a look at this. So if the frequency of interaction between 2 or more persons increases, the degree of their liking for one another will increase and vice versa. So here, this is not written in the form of a hypothesis showing certain predictions, but rather it's just written as a logical statement that how do we reach that level based on our reading? We will have to evaluate lots of previous studies, and we will have to look at the findings of previous research so that we can reach such logical conclusions and create logical statements. So that's the second form of writing or presenting the theoretical framework in quantitative research. The last form or the last method is the visual models. And this helps, especially if the research is maybe scientific in nature, if it's complicated somehow, and if the relationship between the variables is really complicated. So researchers or theorists might use a visual model with arrows, so showing the direction of relationship between the independent variables, dependent variables, intervening variables. A tip for you is that before choosing the theoretical framework, you need to clearly identify your variables, and you need to clearly know the type of the variable in question. Now, is my variable independent or dependent? For example, in the case of sunlight and the amount of growth, is it the sunlight? We said that it's independent because it will affect other variables. An independent variable always affects other variables. A dependent variable is affected by the independent variables. So what is the type of the variable that I have in my research? How are they related to each other? If you know that, then you can, of course, hopefully draw a visual model showing the relationship between the variables and showing the theoretical framework and how it relates to your variables. So if we just kind of summarize the use of theory in quantitative research, as we said, the key word here is test. So in quantitative research, we test the theory, we test hypotheses, right? So you choose a theory based on your readings, based on what suits your research the most. And then you test hypotheses or predictions that are made under that theory. And then the researcher defines and operationalizes variables derived from the theory, and finally measures or observe variables using instruments to obtain the scores. So for example, you have, if we say, for example, you want to give your students a different way of teaching. So this new method of teaching is the independent variable. And you need to see the effect of this new method on their test scores. So the instrument you will be using is a sort of test, and the scores will be the dependent variables. And you will have to relate the scores with independent variables to see if there is a relationship between and if there is an effect or not. So in quantitative research, we start with the theory. and we reach results or conclusions that are unified by the choice of the theory. Now, where do we place theories in writing? Well, we said that we have three forms, a series of hypotheses, or for example, we have logic statements or visual models. Usually, there is no right or wrong here. Each research is different. Each research is the researcher's own story. So most researchers place theories in the introduction. A very common approach is to place it in the literature review section, immediately after hypotheses or research questions. And some researchers, especially in research proposals where they want to emphasize the selection of the theoretical framework, they might dedicate a separate section so that the readers can identify the theory from other components. So you can either place it in the introduction, in any of the forms of your choice, or in the literature review, or in a separate section. Now, how do we actually write a theoretical perspective? Where do we start from? So, as I said earlier, we have to look in the discipline, we have to look in the field, and we have to read a lot. So a keyword here is reading. We have to read, and based on our reading and the discipline, we have to examine prior studies that address the topic or closely related topic. What theories did the authors use? So we don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can actually rely on prior studies and research and see what frameworks, theoretical frameworks that are usually associated with your topic. So this is where you usually start from. Plus, now you looked at the researchers and what they do. For example, you need to evaluate the selection in relation to your study because your variables are different. So in a study, it's the same topic, but probably the researchers looked at age and, for example, proficiency level or some other variables. But in your case, you're looking at something else. You need to explain why the independent variable would influence the dependent variable, for example, or any type of variable you have. Think of the logical relationship between the variables. So this is kind of a script or a template that can be used for any type of research, actually, across disciplines to present the theoretical framework. I'm going to read it here with you. So the theory that I will use is, you write the name of the theory of your choice. It was developed by, you identify the origin, the source, or the developer, the name of the theorist here. And it was used to study. So sometimes you adapt a theory that was used to study something different than your study, but you state that it was originally meant to test or to study something, but I thought it's related to my research, and you show the relationship and you say how and why you chose it. Okay, so I stopped here showing you a script. It acts like a template on how to write the theoretical framework. So you basically state the name of the theory, the person or the researcher who developed it. You identify the topic that it was used to study for, and identify the propositions or the hypotheses in the theory. Also, it will show the relationship. So for example, this theory holds that I would expect my independent variable, which is, for example, sunlight, to influence or explain the dependent variable, which is the amount of growth or the rate of growth. And then because you provide a rationale, stating a rationale for your choice is extremely important, okay? Because it shows that you have this conceptual idea about what suits your research and why is it logical to use this theory among other theories from the literature. So this is a very useful template that I hope you can find, inshallah, useful when you start writing your research. Now we're done with the quantitative research, and we said that theories actually test hypotheses under quantitative research. Now, the variation in theory using qualitative research, it is used as, because qualitative research is more of exploration in nature. So we look at attitudes, at behaviors, and we try to come up with patterns based on these observations. So it is used as a broad explanation for behavior and attitudes, and it may be complete with variables, constructs, and hypotheses. So the use of qualitative theory in qualitative research is different, because here we're not testing a hypothesis, we're not testing the application of the theory, rather we are aiming to generate a theory. And this happens in many of the qualitative research. So it is used as a broad explanation. It is used to provide orienting lens for the study, like studies like gender, class, race, for example, marginalized groups. And in qualitative research, usually the theory is the endpoint. So it's like an inductive process of building from the data to broad themes or generalized model. Now, a very important point here is that sometimes a lot of graduate students read and then they start to see that, well, there is no specific theory here, or there is no explicit mention of theories. That is okay. Sometimes in some qualitative studies, they do not employ an explicit theory, but rather they rely a lot on the conceptual structure, or in other words, the subjective view of the researcher in how the researcher sees the methods, how the researcher sees the observations, and how they interact with each other. So the researcher in this regard will provide a rich description of the central phenomenon, regardless of a particular, of the choice of a particular theoretical framework. So in other words, quantitative research needs to employ a theory, but qualitative research, sometimes there is no need to employ an explicit theory, but rather rely on a conceptual structure and a detailed description of the central phenomenon. Now, just to mention some examples of famous and commonly used qualitative theoretical perspectives, we have the feminist perspectives, and we have the racialized discourses, and we have critical theory. So these are some of the most commonly used examples of qualitative theoretical perspectives. Now, we looked at the flow of the use of theory in quantitative research. We need now to look at the same for qualitative research, which is inductive logic. Why do we say inductive? Because we start with the generalizations and the observation, and then we can actually generate a theory. So usually in qualitative research, researchers poses generalizations or theories from the past and the literature. And then they start to look for broad patterns, generalizations or theories from themes or categories. So it goes both ways. You can either start with the patterns in qualitative research and then you generate a theory, or you can start with a theory and then you look for patterns that actually inform the theory of choice. So researchers analyze data from themes or categories, and the researchers usually ask open-ended questions because they want to gather information. Usually the instruments that are used in qualitative research are interviews and observations, where we can have lots of data that we can actually base patterns or certain categorization and themes in relation to the theory of selection. Now, when it comes to academic writing and where we locate the theory in qualitative research, usually a theory in qualitative research comes in the or occurs in the opening passages of the study. This is an example here, as you can see in the parts in bold first, and they began by relating the participants' experiences to a theoretical model. which is the Tento model of social integration. Thus, the model was not being tested, etc. So you can see here in this example that in qualitative research, usually the theory is presented in the opening passages of the study. Now, when it comes to mixed methods theory use, there are two very common frameworks that are used in mixed methods research, which are the use of social science framework and the use of a participatory social justice framework. Now, these are the two commonly used frameworks, but I will be focusing today on the first one because it's more common than the other. And for the reason of time, I wouldn't be able to go through both of them. But of course, if the second framework relates to your discipline, you can explore more and read more about it. Now, the social science theory use. Now, again, when it comes to writing and presenting social science theory, what do we usually do? So usually we place the theory or the model, and by now I hope that you know that theory and model can be used as synonyms. So we place them at the beginning of the article to guide the questions and the hypotheses in the study. So a theory acts as a guide for the entire questions, for the entire hypothesis. And then we write about the theory by first advancing the name of the theory to be used, followed by a description of how it informs the quantitative and the qualitative components of a mixed method study, because you have quantitative elements and you have qualitative elements. How does the theory inform both components? This is what you need to advance in the writing. In other words, you provide the rationale for your selection. You can also include a diagram, and I highly recommend this in academic writing because a visual representation is always useful, and it makes the theory much easier to grasp by the reader. So include a diagram of the theory that indicates the direction of the probable causal links in the theory and the major concept or variables in the theory. And then have the theory provide a framework for both quantitative and qualitative data collection efforts in the study. So you will also relate the framework of choice to the data collection and the methods you use to collect the data collection. And then you will return to the theory at the end of the study to review how it informed the findings and the results and compared with the use of the theory in other studies. Okay, and this is what usually happens in the discussion section of your research. You revisit the theory and you discuss the findings in relation to the theory and in light of that choice. Now, an example of presenting social science theory. If we take that example, taking a critical realist perspective informed by Rosebands and the model of self-control, you can use that structure actually. Taking a critical perspective or taking a social perspective, if you use this sentence structure, this will explicitly shows the choice of theoretical framework and new research. And then you go on by showing the variables. We combine a quantitative measures of learned resourcefulness with a qualitative text-based analysis to characterize the processes that come into play in the self-management, for example, of pain in high and low resourceful clients, etc. So you start by showing the perspective or the theoretical framework that you selected, and then you show how this framework relates to the variables of the study, whether the study is qualitative or quantitative. Here, of course, we're talking about social science theory, which is commonly used in mixed method research. So here you have to highlight both the quantitative components and the qualitative components. I hope you are following with me here. Now, how do we choose the right theoretical framework? How do we do that?
First, we begin by identifying our beliefs. Now, as researchers, we have beliefs. There are lots of theories, but I'm sure we have certain beliefs in some of them, not all of them. And we have our reasons, our logical, valid reasons. And we can support that. We can support our beliefs with using academic research tools. So begin by identifying your beliefs and then consider several theories that intersect with your values. So I believe that learning a language should be done in a natural way. Therefore, I will focus on the generative theory because they believe in that, for example. And then develop a working knowledge of the theories and understand why each theory is important to you. Why? Why? You can, for example, make a large table where you can divide it into columns. Each column is specified for a particular theory, and to show why each theory is important. What does each theory present to me as a researcher? And then you have, of course, to read a lot. As I told you, reading is really essential here. So conduct a brief literature review to find support for your theories, and consult thesis database, especially if I assume that most of you here are graduate students because this workshop is dedicated for you. You have to look at other theses, okay? You have to look at what others have applied in relation to your topic. Consider the arguments that oppose your beliefs and theories. And this is a very important tip here. You do not only use theories that are actually informing your research, you have to look at theories that oppose your ideas because you need to provide an answer for that as well. So this goes against my study and my beliefs and my arguments, for example, for my research, for these reasons. So you have to be aware of the opposing theories as well. And you have to apply the answers to how the theory connects to your problem and the study's purpose, significance, and design. Now, from my experience, I find that lots of students find it really difficult to connect the theoretical framework with their study. So what they do is that they just actually provide the theoretical framework, describe it, and just don't say anything else. But this is not recommended, and this actually weakens the research. You need to show your theoretical framework that you selected, and you need to show how it connects to your research, the research purpose, the significance, the design, and select, of course, one theoretical framework. After reviewing all theoretical frameworks and previous literature, you have to select one that provides a solid descriptive blueprint for your reader. Now, application. I hope by now that the picture is clear to everyone. And we will look at how we apply that. What are the steps? What are the actual steps to select or to develop a theoretical framework? We have to first state the problem. Here I'm going to use the simple example that I started with, which is that my mom is being upset. This is my problem. And then define the concept. What are the variables? What are the concept or the constructs that needs to be defined? For example, I need to define what I mean by upset. She's angry, blah, blah, blah. I need to define, for example, maybe the temperature of the room, if that is related to the problem. And then I have to develop a relational statement. Maybe because of the increase of the heat in the room, my mom was upset. That's just a simple, very simplistic way of putting it. But I'm now going to move to the more academic examples. And then I have to review theoretical and empirical literatures to see whether my logic is in place, whether actually the theory shows the relationship between the variables. And we need to identify and analyze the existing theories that address the relationships of interest. So stating the problem, defining the concept, the constructs, the variables, developing the relational statements, and then review the theoretical and empirical literature and identify and analyze the existing theories that address the relationship of interest. Okay, application. Here I chose an example from the medicine field. The research problem here is whether a person with a myocardial infarction has inadequate information regarding diet and exercise. This health condition relates to the muscles of the heart, and we need to see whether a person with myocardial infarction has inadequate information. Another research problem that we need to look at whether a sedentary lifestyle is one of the major risk factors for myocardial infarction. It may be due to lack of awareness. So this is our research problem, and this is what we will try to investigate in the research. Step 1, stating the problem, right? So we can say here that assessment of knowledge regarding role of diet and exercises management of clients with myocardial infarction admitted in. Of course, you need to state the context of your study or the location of your study. So in the very first step of developing a theoretical framework, you need to clearly state the research problem. And then you need to define the concepts that are related to your research. In this case, knowledge regarding diet and exercise. So you need to define that, establish the right description or the right definition for that. And then in step 3, we have to clearly establish a relational statement. What is the relationship between the variables here? So a person with adequate knowledge regarding diet and exercise will manage his or her health, for example. This is the relational statement. So if you have adequate knowledge regarding diet and exercise, then you will manage your health in a better way. So there is a kind of a correlation and relationship between adequate knowledge and managing health. Now, step 4 and 5 is to review the literature. Now, in this case, there are different theories in relation to that topic, which is from medicine. And you will review the literature and you will choose the best one for your case. In this case here, we chose a Pender's health promotion model. Now, this is the theory. So you select the theory and you present it in your research. By, for example, here the way they chose is to present it in a visual model. So the theory accounts for the individual characteristics and the experiences, the behavior and the cognition, the behavioral outcome. And it looks also at certain characteristics, the received benefit of action, the barriers to action, etc. And also looks at past experiences. So, for example, does the patient have a past history or a family history in relation to that disease? And then the outcomes will be the commitment to action. So in this case, the commitment to manage your health and health promoting behavior. This is how the author here presented the theory of choice. Now, this step number 7, and in my opinion, step number 7 is the most important step, which is linking the study to your theory. And if you can see here, it's the same visual model, but here the researcher added the variables of the research, which is in this case, the age and gender and their characteristics, and under past experiences, the known case of myocardial infarction. So you relate your variables directly to the theoretical framework, showing how it actually relates. Now, so let's now assume you're done choosing your theoretical framework. It's time now to evaluate your selection. So ask yourself the following questions. Is the theoretical framework clearly identified? Is it consistent with what it is being studied? Are the concepts clearly and operationally defined? Do they reflect the areas of investigation? So the variables that I selected here, are they defined properly? Do they reflect the investigation I'm taking here? Was sufficient literature reviewed to support the proposed relationship? Because you need to show the relationship between the variables. You need to show the relationship between your theory selection and your research. Question number 5, is the theoretical basis for hypothesis formulation clearly articulated? Is it logical? Now, when you read it, does it make sense? In other words, well, it makes sense. Are the relationships among propositions clearly defined? So if I say, for example, the increased amount of sunlight will affect the rate of growth. So is this the relationship clearly identified and clearly defined among variables? Does the instrument used to measure the variables consistent with the theoretical framework? Now, for example, if you say that I'm going to use a natural approach to teaching, then you cannot use official testing and official exams, because this will go against your theoretical framework selection. You have to make sure that the theory you chose actually goes in line with the measure of the variables. And finally, are the study findings related to the theoretical rationale? So these are important questions to evaluate the selection of the theory. And I'm going to conclude here with a very important distinction, just to reiterate what I said in relation to the difference between theoretical framework or theoretical model and conceptual frameworks. Now, remember that a theoretical framework is shows the relationship between the variables and the concepts, and it's a theory that's already established in the literature. And as a researcher, you are applying the theory to the context of your research, whereas a conceptual framework is more subjective to the researchers, and it relates to the researcher's belief and to the researcher's logic, and the view of how the structure of the study flows, and how the theories that the researcher, or the theory that the researcher selected, is more applicable to the research with regards in comparison to other or to other theoretical frameworks. So these are the references that I used today, and I'm going to leave the floor to you now for any questions. And thank you very much for listening. And sorry about what happened.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you so much, Dr. Mona, for this informative and interesting workshop about framework. And again, yeah, sorry for what happened during this lecture. So I shared with you 3 links. The first one is the evaluation form. Please complete it and make sure you write your name and your email correctly. The second one is to make online appointments. And the third one, our YouTube channel. So let's now open the floor for questions or comments. If you have any of them, just post it here in chat or open your mic and ask Dr. Mona. Thank you so much, Dr. Mona. Thank you all for attending the workshop, and inshallah we'll upload this within 24 or 48 hours, inshallah.
You're welcome. Please feel free to ask questions. Okay, can theoretical framework be used in derivatives? Yes, Aroub, it's applicable. Using theories is actually an essential component to all types of research across disciplines. In your case, I believe social science theory might be the best theory to be used, but again, you need to read in the existing literature so that you can identify the best theory for your research and to show the relationship between your research variables as well. I hope that answers your question. Okay, in mixed approach, if there is any finding that contradicts the theoretical concept, how can one reassess and take an alternative? That's an interesting question, Hussein. And it happens sometimes. It happens that you might reach so far, and then you find that your results or something contradicts. If the results contradicts the theory, I don't think there is a problem as long as you are objectively reporting what happened. The most important thing is that we don't want the variables or the research argument itself contradicts the theory in the first place. So it's okay to find, to reach results that do not go in line with the theory, but we have to provide explanations. Why did this happen? Okay, based on previous research. As long as the theory fits from the beginning, you chose the right theory for your topic, then you're fine. Any contradicting results can be justified by relating them to previous research, for example, to other logical answers, justifications in the field. I hope this answers your question, Hussein.
Any other questions or comments? Okay. We have one from Russia here.
Yes, in MA dissertation using a theoretical framework is sufficient, or do we have to include the conceptual? Oh, that's a very interesting question as well, Rasha. To be honest, you need both, okay? And let's say if we talk about quality research, we need a theoretical framework that's based on our reading and selection and the steps that we took to reach the theoretical framework. A conceptual framework is needed because as a researcher, you will show the rationale for the selection of the theoretical framework, right? You will show the reader why did you choose this framework, let's say, in relation to other theoretical frameworks. This is number one. Number two, you will show the relationship between the variables. You will show the logic behind your choice, and you will show how does your finding relate to previous research. So this is your conceptual framework, right, Rasha? So you had a view in relation to the theoretical framework and how it is applied in research. So the answer to your question is that we need both elements in research and in academic research. You're welcome, Rasha.
All right. So it seems that there are no more comments or questions. This is the end of our today's workshop. Thank you, Dr. Mona. It's wonderful workshop and informative. And thank you for attending the workshop. We'll see you, inshallah, next week. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Basim, for organizing it and for giving me this opportunity. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.